6 rounds, 6 hits, 6 bounces. July 11, 1944. A brand new American 76mm gun. A captured German Panther sitting just 200 yards away. Every armor-piercing shell bounced off like it was nothing. The weapon the Army swore would save American tankers failed in front of their eyes. What happened next cost American boys their lives, and almost no one talks about it. A hayfield outside the town of Isigny-sur-Mer, Normandy. 2 weeks earlier, cattle had grazed here. Now the cattle were gone, the fences were broken. Shell craters pocked the soft earth where hooves had left prints just days before. The Panther sat motionless in the center of the field. Its long 75mm gun pointed at nothing. Its hatches were open. Its crew was gone. The tank had been dragged here by American recovery vehicles for a single purpose, to be shot at. 200 yards away, an M4A1 Sherman had rolled into firing position. This was not the old Sherman. This was the new one. The one that carried the 76mm M1 gun, the weapon that American ordnance officers had spent a year developing specifically to solve the problem of heavy German armor. The weapons that staff officers in Washington had described in writing, in reports, in cables, in telephone calls to Supreme Headquarters as the answer. A small group of American officers stood at the edge of the field in pressed uniforms. They had come to watch the answer work. They had watched it fail. The Panther sat there, untouched, scorch marks on its mantlet. Nothing more. The senior ordnance officer present stood at the edge of that hayfield, and he understood. He understood what the telephone call to Supreme Headquarters was going to sound like. He understood what it meant for the thousands of American tank crews already fighting and dying in the Bocage country 30 miles to the south. He understood that every written assurance his department had given to the Supreme Commander had just been proven wrong in front of his own eyes. The report was written, the report was sent, and the report confirmed what General Dwight D. Eisenhower had already heard 9 days earlier. On July 2, 1944, Lieutenant General Lawton Collins had walked into Eisenhower's headquarters in southern England. Collins was 48 years old. He commanded the United States 7th Corps, one of the primary American formations fighting in Normandy. He was not a man given to overstatement. He had earned his nickname, Lightning Joe, not through words, but through the speed of his operations across the Pacific. Collins sat down across from the Supreme Commander and told him the truth. The 76mm gun could not defeat a Panther from the front. What happened next was witnessed by aides and recorded in 3 separate accounts. Eisenhower was 53 years old. He had carried the weight of the largest amphibious invasion in human history on his shoulders for months. He had written the letter accepting full responsibility if D-Day failed. He had sent 150,000 men across the English Channel into the teeth of German fortification. And now he was being told that the gun he had been promised would protect his tank crews could not do the job. His jaw tightened. The blood rose in his face. He looked up at Collins. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" His voice was low, almost quiet. "Why? I was told it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The room went still. Then the language changed. Witnesses described what followed as the angriest they had ever heard the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower had been told repeatedly in writing by his own Ordnance Department that the 76mm gun would handle anything in the German inventory. He had passed those assurances down to his Army Group commanders. He had passed them down to the men planning the armored operations in Normandy. Every single one of those assurances was wrong. And somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy, at that exact moment, young American tank crews were burning to death inside their Shermans because of it. To understand how the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force had been so badly misled, the story has to go backward, 6 months backward, to January 1944, to the American production lines where the first Sherman tanks fitted with the 76mm M1 gun were rolling off the assembly floor. The 76mm gun had been ready earlier than that. Ordnance engineers had developed it through 1943 specifically to give the Sherman more penetrating power. Field reports from Tunisia and Italy had been clear. The standard 75mm gun was running out of margin. German armor was getting thicker. The American medium tank needed a bigger gun. By February 1944, the new 76mm Shermans were being shipped across the Atlantic. By April 10th, 130 of them had been delivered to American depots in southern England. They sat in warehouses and motor pools, paint still fresh, engines cold, ammunition racks loaded, waiting to be issued to the combat units preparing for the invasion of France. They were never issued. The decision came from Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. He was 51 years old, the commander of the 1st United States Army, the man who would lead the American ground force onto the beaches of Normandy. Bradley made the call, and his reasoning was not irrational. He believed his Sherman crews needed time to train on a new weapon system. He believed the logistical burden of supplying 2 different types of tank ammunition across the invasion beaches was too great. And most importantly, he believed, because his intelligence section had told him to believe, that the 75mm gun would be sufficient for whatever the Germans had waiting in Normandy. American military intelligence had estimated that Panther tanks would constitute a small fraction of German armor in the West. A nuisance, not a threat. When American forces hit the beaches on June 6th, the true number was closer to 40% of the German medium tanks in the theater. Not a nuisance, a killing machine. And 130 brand-new Sherman 76mm tanks sat in English depots collecting dust while the men who needed them were dying in France. By the 2nd week of fighting, the bodies of American tankers were being pulled from burning Shermans in numbers that nobody at Bradley's headquarters had prepared for. Crews learned within days what their commanders had not understood. The 75mm gun could penetrate at a Panther's frontal armor at any range, not at 1,000 yards, not at 500, not at 200, not at 50. The Sherman's only option when it met a Panther head-on was to maneuver for a flank shot through the thinner side armor, or to die trying. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where stone walls and sunken lanes channeled every engagement into narrow corridors, where sometimes a Panther appeared around a corner at 50 yards with its gun already pointed at you, there was rarely time to maneuver. That was the war in the first weeks of July 1944. That was the reality that Eisenhower's anger could not change and Bradley's regret could not undo. While Eisenhower sat at his desk reading the Isigny test report, 400 miles to the north, a 29-year-old American officer was finishing the final weeks of training his battalion in England. His name was Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, broad across the shoulders, with a face that gave away nothing, and a habit of biting down on an unlit cigar at moments when other men might have raised their voices. His soldiers had nicknames for him. Some were affectionate, some were not. They all came down to the same observation. Abrams did not flinch. Through April and May, while the 76mm Sherman sat unused in their depots, Abrams worked his crews 7 days a week on the older 75mm version. Gunnery drills on Salisbury Plain, maintenance training in cold metal sheds, tactical exercises across rolling green fields that looked nothing like the close hedgerow country waiting for them across the channel. He knew his men were going to fight Panthers. He had read the intelligence summaries. He had read between the lines. What he did not know, what no one at his level knew, was that a solution to the Panther problem had already been engineered and manufactured in small quantities and was sitting in a quiet brick building outside of Boston. One of Abrams' company commanders was a young captain named James H. Leach. He was in his early 20s. He led Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion. He carried the kind of quiet competence that combat veterans recognize on instinct. In later years, he would say very little about himself in interviews. He would say a great deal about his crews. In the spring of 1944, Leach's men were drilling with 75mm Shermans. He had heard rumors about the 76mm version. He had heard whispers about a special round. None of it had reached him in any concrete form. His tanks had the old gun. His ammunition racks held the old round. His men would land in France in midsummer. They would fight in the same country that was breaking Sherman crews apart. They would do what their training taught them, and they would lose tanks doing it. That was the picture from the front line. From the rear, the picture looked different, but no less painful. First Lieutenant Belton Y. Cooper was 26 years old. He served as a maintenance liaison officer with the 3rd Armored Division. He had a job that nobody volunteered for. He counted dead tanks. Every day in the rolling hill country south of St. Lo, Cooper drove a jeep along behind the advancing American armor. finding the Shermans that had been knocked out and assessing what could be salvaged. Some could be repaired. Their crews survived their wounds and returned to the line. Many could not be repaired. In those cases, the crews had not survived at all. Cooper kept records, careful records. He wrote in a notebook that he would carry through the entire campaign across France, across Belgium, across Germany. Years later, he would publish what he had recorded. He would title it Death Traps. The title was not a metaphor. The solution that no one at the front had seen yet existed inside Watertown Arsenal, a brick complex outside Boston, Massachusetts. Since the spring of 1942, American ordnance engineers there had been working on a new type of armor-piercing round, not a bigger version of the same steel projectile that every tank gun in every army fired, something fundamentally different. The project carried the experimental designation T4. When it was finally standardized for service, it would be designated the M93. The men who eventually fired it would know it by 3 letters and one name only: HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. The physics behind it were elegant and brutal. A standard armor-piercing round defeated armor through mass. A heavy steel projectile hit a steel plate and either punched through or it did not. The harder the armor, the more mass and velocity you needed. HVAP changed that equation entirely. The M93 used a small, dense core of tungsten carbide, one of the harsh substances known to metallurgy, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and capped with a thin ballistic windshield. The tungsten core was the penetrator. The aluminum body was nothing more than a carrier. It held the core stable in the gun barrel and kept it stable in flight. And because that carrier was so much lighter than a solid steel projectile of the same caliber, the gun could push it to far higher velocities. The numbers were dramatic. Where the standard 76mm M62 round left the muzzle at roughly 2,600 feet per second, the M93 HVAP left the muzzle at nearly 3,400 feet per second, 800 feet per second faster. That extra velocity, concentrated into a smaller and harder penetrator, translated directly into the ability to punch through armor that had been considered immune to American tank guns. In testing, the M93 could penetrate a Panther's curved gun mantlet at ranges out to 1,000 yards. It still could not reliably penetrate the steeply sloped glacis plate. But the mantlet was a target. For the first time, a Sherman crew taking a frontal shot at a Panther had a real chance of hitting something the round could go through. But there was a problem that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with geology: tungsten. Tungsten is one of the rarest industrial metals on Earth. It melts at over 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is heavier than lead. It is harder than nearly anything except diamond. And in 1944, the majority of the world's accessible tungsten deposits sat inside 2 countries, China and Bolivia. The Chinese deposits, primarily in Jiangxi province, had accounted for roughly 36% of global tungsten production before the war. By 1944, Japanese occupation of the Chinese coastline made shipping tungsten out of Asia a nightmare of contested convoys through hostile waters. Some shipments made it through, many did not. The Bolivian deposits, mined high in the Andes and shipped through Pacific coast ports, were more reliable. American purchasing agents had secured long-term contracts, but there was never enough. The American war economy in 1944 had 3 competing demands for the same tungsten. The first was machine tools, the hard cutting bits used to manufacture aircraft engines, gun barrels, ship turbines, and every other piece of precision machinery in the entire war effort were made from tungsten carbide. Without those cutting bits, American factories slowed. With them, American industry could outproduce anything Germany or Japan could field. The second demand was armor-piercing ammunition, not just for the Sherman's 76mm gun, but for the 90mm gun on the new M36 tank destroyer and the 90mm anti-aircraft gun being adapted for anti-tank work. Every HVAP round in every caliber ate into the same tungsten budget. The third demand was smaller but real. Tungsten alloys went into armor plate, electrical contacts, and the filaments of radio tubes. Each use had a constituency in Washington fighting for its share. In the spring of 1944, when the decision came down to whether scarce tungsten should go to mass production of HV rounds or stay in the machines shops that kept American industry running, the answer was no. Industry came first. That decision was made in air-conditioned offices in Washington, by men in suits who had read reports and studied production charts and weighed competing priorities and made a rational calculation. They had never seen a Sherman burn. They had never watched a crew die inside a hull they could not escape. They had never stood in a French orchard at dawn and counted the dead. Their math was correct. Their priorities were defensible. And the men who would pay for those priorities were finishing their training in England, loading 75mm rounds into tanks that could not kill the enemy they were about to face, writing letters home to mothers and girlfriends in towns whose names would never appear in any history book. The fight was about to begin. By late July 1944, First Lieutenant Belton Cooper had stopped noticing the smell. That was the thing about his job. The thing he would never say directly in the memoir he would write decades later, but that sat underneath every page of it. You got used to certain things because the alternative was to stop functioning, and Cooper could not afford to stop functioning because someone had to count the dead tanks, and the Army had decided that someone was him. Every morning, Cooper climbed into his Jeep and drove forward along the trails that the advancing American armor had cut through the hedgerow country south of St. Lo. He followed the track marks, the broad double prints of Sherman treads pressed into mud and crushed stone, and the broken roots of hedgerows that had stood for centuries before the war had torn them apart. Where the tracks stopped, Cooper usually found what he was looking for: a burned-out Sherman, sometimes still smoking, sometimes cold, sometimes sitting upright in a lane with its hatches open and its crew gone, evacuated to an aid station, or already dead. Sometimes flipped on its side by the force of an internal explosion, the ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that blew the turret clear of the hull and left it lying in a ditch 20 feet away like a discarded helmet. Cooper kept records. He wrote in a small notebook. He recorded the unit markings, the hull number, the type of damage, the condition of the crew. He assessed what could be salvaged. A road wheel here, a transmission there, track links, periscopes, anything that could be pulled from a dead tank and bolted onto a living one to keep the division moving forward. Some of those dead tanks told stories that stayed with him. He would write about a Sherman whose entire crew of 5 had been killed by a single penetrating round through the right side of the hull. One round, 5 men. The projectile had entered the hull at a shallow angle, traveled through the fighting compartment, and fragmented against the far wall. The crew had not burned. They had simply been killed where they sat, by the physics of a tungsten-hardened steel core, passing through 3 inches of armor plate and turning everything on the other side into shrapnel. He would write about another tank. This one had taken a hit in the engine compartment. The gasoline had ignited. 4 of the 5 crew members had gotten out through the turret hatches. They had dropped to the ground and rolled into the nearest cover, an apple orchard 50 feet from the road. The 5th man, the loader, had not gotten out. The loader was a teenager from Ohio. His foot had been pinned under a piece of the ammunition rack that had been bent inward by the impact. He could not free himself. The fire reached him before anyone could get back to the tank. His crewmates listened from the orchard. Cooper recorded it. He did not editorialize. He did not write about what it sounded like. He did not need to. Anyone who has ever heard a man burn knows what it sounds like, and anyone who has not does not need the description. What Cooper wrote was the hull number, the unit, the date, the nature of the damage, and the disposition of the crew. 4 evacuated, 1 killed in action. That was the war in Normandy for the men who fought it from inside American medium tanks, and for the one man whose job it was to document what was left of those tanks after the fighting moved on. By the 3rd week of July, the American situation in the Bocage had passed from frustration into something that the official histories would later describe with careful, clinical language. The language of the men who were there was not clinical. The 75mm Sherman could not kill a Panther from the front. Period. Every American tanker who had survived an engagement with one carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest. The 76mm Shermans that Bradley had refused to issue before D-Day were finally being rushed forward by the hundreds, pulled from their English depots on emergency orders, shipped across the Channel, and distributed to the armored divisions that had been bleeding into the hedgerows for 6 weeks. They had been promoted in the planning documents as the solution. They were better than the 75. That much was true. Against Panzer IVs and assault guns and half-tracks and the lighter vehicles that filled out most German formations, the 76mm gun worked. But against a Panther's front armor, 7 inches of effective protection created by 80mm of steel, sloped at 55 degrees, the standard M62 armor-piercing round still bounced. The crews learned what worked. They learned it the way soldiers learn everything. Through blood. You did not engage a Panther from the front if you could avoid it. You backed your Sherman into an orchard or behind a stone wall and waited for the Panther to pass. Then you hit it from behind, in the engine deck, where the armor was thin. If you were lucky, the Panther burned. If you were not lucky, the Panther's turret traversed fast enough to put a round into your hull before you could fire a second shot. Some crews were luckies, some were not. On the morning of July 25, 1944, the ground south of St. Lo shook. Operation Cobra had begun. 1,500 American heavy bombers filled the sky. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, stacked in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, dropped their payloads onto a narrow corridor of German positions held by the Panzerlehr Division. Panzerlehr was an elite formation. Until that morning, it had been considered one of the most lethal armored units in the Wehrmacht. Its commander would later describe the bombing as something out of the end of the world. Entire positions were erased. Tanks were flipped upside down by the concussion. Men were buried alive in their foxholes. But the bombs fell short in places. American soldiers died under American bombs that morning. And among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. McNair had shaped American armored doctrine. He had been one of the architects of the system that had decided what tanks the Army would build, what guns those tanks would carry, and how those tanks would be used in combat. He had come to Normandy to observe the breakout. He was standing in a forward observation position when the bombs found him. He was the highest-ranking American officer, killed in the European theater of operations. The man who had helped design the doctrine was killed by his own Air Force on the morning that doctrine was supposed to prove itself. 102 M4A1 76mm Shermans were in the lead formations that poured through the gap Cobra had torn in the German line. They performed better than the 75mm models they were replacing. Against the Panzer IVs and the Stu-G assault guns that made up the bulk of the surviving German armor in the sector, the new gun was effective. Against the Panthers, the after-action reports read the same way they had read before Cobra. Crews described firing at Panthers from 1,000 yards, from 800, from 500. They described watching the M62 round strike the sloped glacis plate and skip away over the next hedge. They described the sound it made, a sharp metallic crack followed by a whine as the deflected round tumbled through the air and disappeared. Some commanders found ways to hit Panthers from behind at ranges so close that the muzzle blast scorched the German engine deck. Some did not get the chance. Their crews died in the lane facing forward, gun loaded with a round that could not do what it needed to do. That was July. In the first week of September 1944, 8 weeks after the Isigny demonstration, a Liberty ship entered the harbor at Cherbourg. In its hold, packed in wooden crates stamped with Watertown Arsenal markings, was a shipment that had been chasing the American armored divisions across the Atlantic for 2 months. M93 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, tungsten carbide cores wrapped in aluminum bodies. The round that the engineers in Boston had designed to solve the Panther problem. Roughly 1,000 rounds. For the entire European theater of operations. 1,000 rounds. For an army fighting across a front that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. For armored divisions that had lost hundreds of Sherman since June and were now pushing eastward across France at speeds that had outrun their own supply lines. The distribution followed the path that every piece of military supply follows in a large bureaucracy. The 12th Army Group Ordnance Section divided the shipment among the armies. The armies divided their share among the corps divided among the divisions among the battalions among the company. By the time the wooden crates reached the platoon sergeants who would actually hand the rounds to the gunners who would actually fire them, simple arithmetic had done its work. 4 rounds per tank. In some cases 6. In a few cases none at all. The orders that came with the rounds were specific. Save them. Do not waste them on Panzer IVs, or assault guns, or half-tracks, or anything that the standard M62 could handle. These rounds are for Panthers and Tigers. Verify the target before you fire, because once the 4 rounds are gone, they are gone, and there is no telling when the next shipment will arrive. Tank commanders began carrying handwritten lists in their breast pockets. Which tank in the platoon had used its HVAP? Which tank still had all 4? Which tank had 2 left, and which tank had none? The commander with the most HVAP rounds became the platoon's anti-Panther reserve. He would be sent forward when a Panther was identified. The others would stay back and try not to attract attention. That was how the war was being fought in the late summer of 1944. With handwritten lists in breast pockets and 4 tungsten rounds in a ready rack, and the knowledge that when those 4 rounds were gone, you were back to bouncing steel off of German armor and hoping the German gunner missed you first. 400 miles to the southeast, George Patton's Third Army was running out of gasoline. Patton was 59 years old, profane and brilliant and relentlessly impatient. He had driven his armored divisions across France faster than any American formation had ever moved in any war. His lead elements had reached the Moselle River by early September. From the Moselle to the Rhine was less than 100 miles. From the Rhine to Berlin was a war-winning advance. He never got the fuel to make it. The supply lines from the invasion beaches had been stretched beyond their limit. The Red Ball Express, the improvised truck convoy system that kept the frontline divisions fed and fueled, could not keep up with Patton's pace. By mid-September, his armored divisions were down to a few hours of fuel per tank. But the 4th Armored Division still had enough to push across the Moselle and seize a bridgehead near a small French town that most Americans had never heard of and would never hear of again: Arracourt. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams brought his 37th Tank Battalion across the river and dug in. His Shermans took up positions along the low ridgelines south and east of the town. His crews had been fighting since late July. They had crossed France in the Great Pursuit after Cobra. They were veterans now. They knew their machine. They knew the terrain. They knew how to fight. And each of their tanks carried 4 to 6 rounds of M93 HVAP in the ready rack. The Germans noticed the bridgehead. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied the situation map and saw an opportunity. An American armored division, overextended, short on fuel, sitting exposed east of the Moselle. He ordered a counterattack. He had 2 newly raised panzer brigades available, the 111th and the 113th. Both had been formed in the summer of 1944 as part of Hitler's personal directive to create fast-reaction armored formations that could be thrown at Allied penetrations. They were equipped with factory-new Panther tanks straight off the production lines at Daimler-Benz and MAN. 42 Panthers in one battalion, 40 Panzer IVs in the other. Fresh paint, full ammunition, new engines. The order went to General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel. He was 47 years old, a small, wiry man barely over 5 feet tall, who carried himself with the kind of professional military bearing that traced back through generations of Prussian officers. Manteuffel had taken command of the 5th Panzer Army only days before. He looked at the same maps Hitler was looking at, and he saw something different from what Hitler saw. He saw that the Panzer brigades were not ready. Oberst Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf commanded the 113th Panzer Brigade. His brigade had been formed in July. His tank crews had completed approximately 6 weeks of training. Much of that training had been conducted without enough fuel to run actual gunnery exercises. They had practiced loading drills with the engine off. They had studied range cards on classroom walls. They had learned the theory of armored warfare from instructors who had fought in Russia and who understood that theory and practice were 2 very different things. The brigade had no proper reconnaissance units. The Panzer Brigade organization that Hitler had personally directed contained no integrated scout elements, no armored cavalry, no forward observers with radios who could probe ahead and find the enemy before the main body stumbled into him. The brigades were designed to move forward in armored columns and smash through enemy lines by sheer weight of metal. That was the doctrine, that was the order. Manteuffel sent them forward, because that was the order, and a German general in September 1944, who refused a direct order from Adolf Hitler, did not remain a general for long. On the morning of September 19, 1944, the 113th Panzer Brigade moved out toward the American bridgehead at Arracourt. The fog was so thick that the lead tanks could not see 50 feet ahead. Fog in the Lorraine in September was not unusual. The river valleys collected moisture overnight, and in the early morning hours, the mist sat low and heavy across the fields and orchards and farm roads that connected the villages. It burned off by mid-morning most days. But on this morning it held, and fog changed everything. The Panther tank had been designed to fight at range. Its long 75mm K-42 gun could reach out and kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. Its Zeiss optics were superb. Its sloped frontal armor was designed to deflect incoming rounds at distances where the Panther's own gun could penetrate anything it faced. At range, in clear weather, a Panther was a lethal machine with few equals on any battlefield in the world. At 75 meters, in fog so thick you could not see the tree line, none of that mattered. South of the village of Isigny, Captain James Leach's Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion sat in hull-down positions along a low ridge. They had been briefed the night before. Panthers were expected from the east. Each tank had HVAP rounds in the ready rack. The order was simple. Wait for them to come close. The fog will keep them close. Then fire. The first Panthers rolled out of the mist at a distance of about 75 meters. Leach's gunners saw the dark shapes materialize in the gray wall of fog. The long gun barrels appeared first, then the hulls, then the tracks grinding over the wet earth. The Americans fired first. The first Panther took a round through the mantlet. The tank stopped. A thin trail of smoke began to curl from the commander's hatch. The crew did not emerge. A second Panther rolled past the first one, blind in the fog, its turret traversing left and right, searching for the source of the gunfire. It never found it. A Sherman round struck it in its side, where the armor was only 40 millimeters of vertical steel. The Panther brewed up immediately. Orange flame and black smoke erupted from every hatch and seam in the hull. Within the first 10 minutes of contact, Company B had destroyed 5 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs. The German crews did what their 6 weeks of training had taught them. They pushed forward into the contact. That was the doctrine. Maintain momentum, close with the enemy. Use the weight of the formation to overwhelm the defense. In clear weather, with proper reconnaissance, against a weaker enemy, it might have worked. In fog, against veteran American crews who had been fighting since Normandy and who knew exactly where the Germans had to come from. Because the terrain funneled them into predictable corridors, it was a death sentence. The Panthers came forward in column because the roads forced them into column. They emerged from the fog one at a time, or 2 at a time, into the sights of American gunners who were already laid on the kill zone and waiting. Some German crews never saw the Sherman that killed them. Some saw it for the half-second between the muzzle flash and the impact. Oberst Erich von Senger und Etterlin, a colonel serving in the 113th Panzer Brigade, was wounded sometime during the morning engagement. The details of exactly where and how have been lost to the confusion of close-range combat in near-zero visibility. What is recorded is that he was hit, that he was pulled from his command vehicle, and that he died the following day, September 20th, 1944. He was the highest-ranking German officer killed at Arracourt. The battle did not end on the 19th. It continued for 11 days. The 113th Panzer Brigade attacked again on the 20th, and the 22nd, and the 25th. Each time the pattern repeated. German armor advanced into fog or low visibility. American tanks and tank destroyers caught them in prepared positions, and the exchange favored the defenders. The 111th Panzer Brigade was committed in subsequent days. It met the same result. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19th Tactical Air Command flew through breaks in the cloud cover and dove on German columns with rockets and 50 caliber machine guns. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M18 Hellcats, fast and lightly armored vehicles built for speed rather than protection, used their mobility to swing around the flanks of German formations and hit them from the sides where the armor was thin. By September 29th, when the battle ended, the 113th Panzer Brigade had been reduced from approximate last 90 operational tanks and assault guns to fewer than 20. The 111th had been similarly destroyed. Total German losses across the 11 days of fighting approached 86 armored vehicles, destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. The American 4th Armored Division had lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. The exchange ratio was devastating. But the truth of Arracourt, the truth that emerged in the after-action reports, and that the men who fought it understood in their bones, was more complicated than the numbers. HVAP had not won this battle alone. The fog had won most of it. The fog had stripped the Panther of every advantage it had been designed to exploit. No long-range gunnery, no superior optics, no ability to stand off at 1,000 yards and pick apart the American tanks one by one. The fog had turned every engagement into a knife fight at distances, where the Sherman's disadvantages in armor and gun performance mattered far less than the crew's ability to see first and shoot first. The doctrine had won part of it. The Panzer brigades had no scouts, no infantry, no air cover. They attacked in columns along predictable routes against an enemy who had established interlocking fields of fire across terrain that funneled the attackers into kill zones. The Americans had all three of the things the Germans lacked. They had reconnaissance elements screening forward. They had infantry dug in along the flanks. They had the 19th Tactical Air Command overhead whenever the weather allowed. The training had won part of it. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division had been fighting since late July. They knew how to call in artillery. They knew how to coordinate with infantry. They knew how to read terrain and find hull-down positions and set up ambushes. The German crews in the Panzer brigades had 6 weeks. 6 weeks was not enough, and the M93 HVAP round had won part of it. When the fog cleared enough for engagements at 300 or 500 yards, when a Panther presented its mantlet or its turret face to an American gunner, the tungsten round could punch through armor that had been impervious to every American tank round in Normandy. That mattered. It mattered to the gunner who loaded it, and the commander who called the shot, and the crew that watched the Panther stop and smoke. But Arracourt was not a story about a wonder weapon. It was a story about what happened when a well-trained, well-led American formation with combined arms coordination and air superiority and good terrain caught a badly organized, poorly trained German formation without reconnaissance or infantry support in conditions that negated the German tank's greatest strengths. The HV round was one factor among many. It was not the deciding factor. Anyone who claims it was has not read the after-action reports carefully enough. The war moved east. October came. The rain turned the roads of Lorraine into rivers of mud. The advance slowed, supply lines stretched, and the M93 HV round remained scarce. Production at Watertown Arsenal had increased. More tungsten was being allocated. More rounds were being manufactured and crated and shipped. But the pipeline from Boston to the front lines in eastern France was long and fragile, and the front-line units that needed the ammunition most were often the last to receive it. Tank crews who had used their HVAP at Arracourt waited weeks for resupply. Some received a few additional rounds in October, some did not. The handwritten lists in the breast pockets were updated and updated again. On November 20th, 1944, a Sherman tank from the 2nd Armored Division engaged a German Panther near the town of Versellen, just outside the city of Aachen. Aachen had been the first German city to fall to the Americans. The fighting there had been house to house, block by block, a kind of warfare that tankers dreaded because every window was a potential hiding place for a man with a Panzerfaust, and every rubble pile could conceal an anti-tank gun. The 2nd Armored Division had fought through the approaches to Aachen and into the flat, open country beyond it, where the terrain favored armor and the engagement ranges stretched out to 800 and 1,000 yards. The tank commander in this engagement was Sergeant Francis W. Baker. He was 24 years old. He was a veteran. He had fought in North Africa. He had fought in Sicily. He had fought across Normandy and into Belgium and now into the western fringes of Germany itself. He was one of the most experienced tank commanders in the 2nd Armored Division. His gun was the 76mm M1. His ammunition rack contained M93 HVAP rounds, more of them than he had carried at any previous point in the war. The Panther appeared at a range of approximately 800 yards. It presented its side, its flank, 40 millimeters of vertical steel plate, the thinnest armor on the entire tank. At 800 yards with HVAP loaded, Baker's gunner should have been able to punch through that side plate with ease. The ballistic tables said so. The test report said so. The ordnance officers who had designed the round said so. Baker's gunner fired. The first round struck the Panther's flank. It did not penetrate. The gunner adjusted and fired again. Another hit. No penetration. A third round. A fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. 7 rounds of M93 HVAP. 7 impacts on 40 millimeters of vertical steel at 800 yards. 7 rounds that should have gone through that armor the way a rifle bullet goes through a tin can. Not one of them penetrated. The Panther turned away and withdrew from the engagement without returning fire. Its crew may not have even known how close they had come to dying 7 times. They drove into the November dusk and disappeared. Inside Baker's Sherman, there was silence. The gunner sat at his sight and said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice carried the kind of disbelief that comes when something you have staked your life on fails in front of your eyes. The loader stood behind the breech with his hands empty. There was nothing left to load. The commander, Baker himself, looked through his periscope at the place where the Panther had been and tried to understand what had just happened. 7 rounds, 7 hits, 0 penetrations on the thinnest plate of the target. Baker would testify to American ordnance investigators about what he had seen. He would describe watching the orange streaks of his own tracer rounds curve into the German tank and bounce off the side plate at angles that should have been lethal. He would describe the silence in his tank afterward. He would describe the slow, cold understanding that the round they had been told would save their lives could fail. The metallurgists at Watertown Arsenal would eventually study Baker's report, alongside similar reports from other units. They would examine the manufacturing records. They would test rounds from the same production batches, and they would reach a conclusion that no one in the field wanted to hear. The tungsten carbide cores in some production batches had been brittle. The manufacturing process for tungsten carbide was exacting. The cores had to be sintered at precise temperatures and pressures to achieve the right combination of hardness and toughness. Hardness allowed the core to bite into armor plate without deforming. Toughness allowed it to absorb the shock of impact without shattering. In some batches, the balance had been wrong. The cores were hard enough, but they were not tough enough. At certain impact angles under certain conditions, they shattered on contact instead of penetrating. The tungsten fragments sprayed across the surface of the armor plate like broken glass instead of boring through it. The metallurgists would fix the problem. The manufacturing process would be refined. Later production runs would be more consistent. But that was later. That was in a laboratory in Massachusetts. That was in a report that would take weeks to write and months to implement. For Sergeant Baker and his crew, sitting in their Sherman in the November dusk outside Versailles, the fix did not exist yet. What existed was the knowledge that the weapon they had counted on could betray them, that 7 rounds could hit and 7 rounds could fail, that no weapon, no matter how advanced, no matter how carefully engineered, was a guarantee. Baker's tank survived that engagement. The Panther survived as well. Both crews drove away into the fading light to fight someone else on some other day in some other field. That was what the war looked like in the autumn of 1944 for the men who fought it from the inside of an American medium tank. A weapon that sometimes worked, a weapon that sometimes did not, and no way to know which it would be until the round left the barrel and either punched through or bounced off and left you sitting in a steel box waiting for the enemy to fire back. Behind the lines, Cooper was still counting. His jeep had carried him out of Normandy, across the open country of northern France, through Belgium, and into the approaches to Aachen. His notebook was filling up. The entries had a rhythm to them by now. Hull number, unit, date, nature of damage, disposition of crew. The words changed, but the pattern did not. By the end of November, the American armies had fought their way to the German border along most of the Western Front. The Siegfried Line, the belt of fortifications that the Germans had built along their frontier in the 1930s, had been breached in places but not broken. The Hürtgen Forest, a dark tangle of pine trees and concrete bunkers southeast of Aachen, had consumed entire American infantry divisions in weeks of fighting that produced casualty rates comparable to the worst battles of the First World War. The armored divisions had done their part. They had pushed forward when the terrain allowed and had sat idle when it did not. They had lost tanks steadily through the autumn, not in the dramatic armored clashes of Arracourt, but in the grinding, day-by-day attrition of a front that moved slowly and cost heavily. And in their ammunition racks, the M93 HVAP rounds remained scarce, a few more per tank than in September, perhaps 8 or 10 by November. Not enough to change the fundamental calculus of an engagement with a Panther. Enough to give a crew a chance if the angle was right, if the range was right, if the round was from a good batch. If the men who carried those rounds did not think in terms of metallurgy or production statistics or supply chain logistics. They thought in terms of the count. How many do I have? How many has my wingman used? How many are left in the platoon? They thought in terms of the count, the pencil marks crossed out and rewritten as rounds were fired and not replaced. They did not know that in 6 weeks, on a cold December morning in a forest, they had been told, was a quiet sector. Every round they had would be needed. Every round they had would not be enough. And the longest, coldest battle of the war in Western Europe was about to begin. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes. The men of the 28th Infantry Division had been told they were sitting on a quiet sector. The Ardennes was a rest area, a place where divisions rotated through after being chewed up somewhere else. The 28th had come out of the Hurtgen forest with the kind of casualty lists that made headquarters staff go quiet when they read them. They had been sent to the Ardennes to absorb replacements and recover. The forest around them was dark. Pine trees, tall and close together, covered the ridgelines and the valleys and the narrow roads that wound through the hills of eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. The terrain was supposed to be impassable for armor. Intelligence had reported no significant German activity for weeks. The men slept in farmhouses and barns and foxholes that they had not bothered to deepen because no one was shooting at them. At 5:30 in the morning, roughly 1,600 German artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire along an 80-mile front. The sound was unlike anything the men in the forward positions had ever heard. Not the sharp crack of a single gun or the staggered thumping of a battery firing for effect. This was a wall of noise, a continuous roar that shook the frozen ground and split the pine trees and turned the pre-dawn darkness into a flickering orange nightmare of explosions that walked across the American positions from north to south without pause. Behind the artillery barrage came 250,000 German soldiers, 5 Panzer divisions, 3 SS Panzer divisions, Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and the new King Tigers. 68 tons of armor plate carrying a long 88mm gun that could reach out and kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The heaviest, most powerfully armed tank in the world in December 1944. A machine that no American tank gun firing standard ammunition could defeat from any angle at any range that mattered. The Ardennes offensive had begun. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge, after the shape the German salient made on the maps as it pushed westward into Belgium. Hitler had stripped his entire army of its last armored reserves for this single gamble. Punch through the American lines, reach the port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies, force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. For the American Sherman crews in the path of that offensive, December 16th was the day the war became something it had never been before. It became a fight for survival. The HVAP shortage hit immediately, and it hit hard. The average Sherman 76mm in the Ardennes carried approximately 5 rounds of M93. 5 rounds against an enemy that was throwing hundreds of Panthers and dozens of Tigers and King Tigers at a single American sector on a single morning. Tank battalions reported using their entire HVAP allocation in a single day of combat and finding no resupply available. Production had increased. By November, American arsenals were turning out 5,000 M93 rounds per month. By January, the number would reach 7,000. But production at an arsenal in Massachusetts did not mean ammunition in a tank's ready rack in the forests of Belgium. The rounds had to be shipped to England, then across the Channel, then forward by truck convoy, through roads that were now choked with snow and blocked by retreating traffic, and interdicted by German artillery and German patrols probing deep into the American rear. Some shipments never reached the front. Others reached the wrong units. Others sat in supply dumps that were overrun by the German advance before they could be distributed. Tank crews who survived the first days of the offensive described the moment when the gunner loaded the last HVAP round, fired it at a Panther, and turned to the loader for another. And the loader said there was nothing left. After that, they fired standard M62. And standard M62 against a King Tiger at any range was not a weapon, it was a signal. It told the German crew exactly where you were hiding. The weather made everything worse. For the first 8 days of the offensive, low cloud cover and heavy snow held the American Air Force on the ground. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that had shattered German columns at Arracourt, that had been the decisive edge in every major engagement since Normandy, could not fly. The American tankers, who had grown used to calling in air support whenever they encountered a Panther, now had to fight those Panthers alone. With 5 HVAP rounds, sometimes fewer. In the twin villages of Creighton and Rocherath, on the northern shoulder of the German advance, the fighting reached a kind of intensity that the men who survived it would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. Elements of the 2nd Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division held those villages against the 12th SS Panzer Division through 3 days of close-range combat that left the burned-out hulks of American and German tanks sitting in the same streets, sometimes within arm's reach of each other. American bazooka teams crept along basement walls and through shattered doorways and fired at Panthers from distances of 20 feet. At 20 feet, you could see the welds on the German tank's hull. You could see the mud on the tracks. You could hear the engine idling. The bazooka round was a shaped charge. It did not need velocity. It needed proximity. And the men who fired those rounds provided proximity by walking up to a 60-ton machine with a tube on their shoulder and a prayer they did not say out loud. Sherman crews backed their tanks into barns and cowsheds and waited in the darkness for German armor to pass through the village streets. When a Panther rolled past the barn door, the Sherman fired into the engine deck from behind at a range so close that the muzzle blast shattered the remaining windows in the building. Some of those shots killed the Panther. Some did not. Some of those Sherman crews fired and then reversed out through the back wall of the barn before the Panther's turret could traverse. Tank destroyer battalions with M10s and M36s sat in concealed positions along forest tracks and waited for King Tigers to lumber into their kill zones. The M36 carried a 90mm gun. With HVAP, it could penetrate a King Tiger's turret face at combat ranges. Without HVAP, it could not penetrate much of anything on a King Tiger at all. The crews who had HVAP fought. The crews who did not waited and hoped for a flank shot or a miracle. Some of those Americans were 19 years old. 6 months earlier, they had been farmers in Ohio, mechanics in Pennsylvania, college students in California. Now they were fighting through the longest, coldest nights of their lives with the knowledge of exactly how many rounds they had left and exactly what would happen when those rounds were gone. The weather broke on December 23rd. Christmas Eve dawned cold and clear. By mid-morning, the sky over the Ardennes was filled with Allied aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts from the Ike Tactical Air Command, British Typhoons, American B-26 medium bombers. They found the German columns clustered along the narrow road networks that the Ardennes terrain forced them to use. Roads through forests, roads through valleys, roads across bridges that could not be bypassed because the ground on either side was too soft or too steep for 70-ton tanks. The pilots found those columns and they destroyed them. Piece by piece, vehicle by vehicle across the next 10 days. Rockets into engine decks, 500-pound bombs into crossroads, 50-caliber machine gun fire raking the soft-skinned supply trucks that carried the fuel and ammunition the Panzer divisions needed to keep moving. The German offensive had already been overextended. It had already been running low on fuel. Now it was being torn apart from above by an air force it could no longer contest. By late January 1945, the bulge in the line had been pushed back almost entirely to its starting position. The ground that the Germans had paid for with 250,000 men had been reclaimed by the Allies at a cost of approximately 80,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The German army had lost approximately 100,000 men, and it had spent the last fully equipped armored reserves it would ever possess. It was the last great German offensive of the war. It was stopped by infantry holding strong points at crossroads, by tank destroyers in ambush positions, by the Third Army racing north from Lorraine to relieve Bastogne, by the weather breaking and the Air Force coming back, and by the simple fact that the Germans had run out of fuel before they had run out of road. The fuel was the story. It had always been the story. Across the spring of 1945, as American and British armies crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies stormed across the Vistula and the Oder, the German war economy collapsed in a way that no one inside Germany had predicted and no one inside Germany could stop. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, fell off a cliff. The Mann plant in Nuremberg was bombed repeatedly. The Daimler-Benz plant in Berlin was bombed repeatedly. The MNH plant in Hanover was bombed repeatedly. Components that had to travel by railrail between factories sat in marshalling yards that no longer had intact tracks. Steel that had to come from the Ruhr now had to wait for a freight network that the American 8th Air Force and British Bomber Command were dismantling span by span, bridge by bridge, junction by junction. In January 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive captured the industrial region of Upper Silesia. Silesia had supplied Germany with a substantial fraction of its coal, its steel, and its synthetic fuel. With Silesia gone, Germany lost the ability to produce the things a modern army needs to fight. And the things a modern army needs most are fuel and ammunition. In the final months of the war, hundreds of Panthers, hundreds of Tigers, hundreds of King Tigers were abandoned by their own crews on roadsides and in farmyards and in forest clearings across western Germany. Not because American tanks had defeated them, not because HVAP had punched through their armor, because the fuel trucks never arrived, because the supply dumps had been bombed, because the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, had ceased to function as a transportation network and had become a collection of broken tracks and cratered yards. A King Tiger weighed 68 tons. It burned roughly 3 gallons of gasoline per mile under combat conditions. A King Tiger with empty fuel tanks was not a weapon. It was a 68-ton steel monument to industrial defeat. Post-war examination of the German tanks that survived the war or were captured intact told a story that the German High Command had been hiding from itself for months. Many of those tanks had full ammunition racks. Many had functioning guns. Many had crews who had been willing to fight and who had been trained to fight and who had sat in their vehicles and waited for fuel that never came. The HVAP round had nothing to do with that. The HVAP round had been a partial answer to a tactical problem in a specific class of engagement. It had mattered at Arracourt. It had mattered at Creighton. It had mattered in 100 small engagements across the autumn and winter of 1944, where an American gunner loaded a tungsten round and put it through a Panther's mantlet and saved his crew for one more day. But it had not won the war. What won the war was something larger and less dramatic and far less suited to a story about tanks and ammunition. What won the war was the American industrial economy operating at full mobilization. And here was the final irony, the deepest irony of the entire story. Germany had invented the tungsten-cored armor-piercing round. The Panzergranate 40, the German equivalent of HVAP, had entered service in 1940. German metallurgists had understood from the very beginning that a small, dense tungsten core driven at high velocity would defeat armor in ways that solid steel could not. They had built these rounds in calibers ranging from the 37mm anti-tank gun to the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. They had used them in North Africa and in Russia and on every front where German armor fought, but Germany had less tungsten than the United States. By 1943, German production of Panzergranate 40 had been cut sharply. The tungsten that remained was being reserved for cutting tools needed by machine shops, producing aircraft engines and submarine components. The same calculation that had been made in air-conditioned offices in Washington had been made in offices in Berlin. And both governments had reached the same conclusion. Industry came first. By 1944, German Panther crews were firing standard armor-piercing rounds, not tungsten-cored ammunition. The country that had pioneered the concept had run out of the raw material to use it. The country that had not invented the concept had secured enough tungsten through geographic luck and diplomatic effort and the simple advantage of controlling sea lanes that connected American ports to the mines of Bolivia to produce 33,000 rounds of M93 HVAP by March of 1945. The phrase in the title of this story, that the Germans never expected HVAP to turn Shermans into Panther slayers, was not quite true. The Germans understood tungsten-cored ammunition perfectly well. They had built it first. What the Germans did not expect was that American industry could produce it in quantities that mattered while their own industrial machine, ground down by strategic bombing and the loss of critical resources, no longer could. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the average American 76mm Sherman had received a total of perhaps 15 to 20 HVAP rounds across the entire campaign. Some had received fewer. A few priority units had received more. None had received enough to stop worrying about how many they had left. Belton Cooper finished the war as a captain. He had crossed Germany with the 3rd Armored Division all the way to the Mulde River, where the American and Soviet armies met. He had stopped counting dead Shermans somewhere in the Rhineland because the numbers had become the same column repeated over and over again. By the end, the 3rd Armored Division alone had lost approximately 648 Sherman tanks across the campaign. His division had been called the Spearhead Division. It had earned the name. It had paid for it. Decades later, Cooper published the notebook entries he had kept across those months. He titled the book Death Traps. He argued that the men who had directed American tank policy in the early 1940s had built the wrong tank and that thousands of young Americans had died because of that decision. Historians argued with him. They said the Sherman, taken on its own terms as a balance between armor and firepower and reliability, and the ability to be produced in enormous numbers and shipped across an ocean and maintained in the field by 19-year-old mechanics, had been a reasonable design for the war. America was actually fighting. They pointed to the production numbers. They pointed to the strategic outcome. They pointed to survival rates that were not dramatically worse than those of German tank crews. Some of those historians were right. Cooper was also right. Both things can be true at the same time. And neither truth brings back the loader from Ohio. Creighton Abrams survived the war. He continued to serve. He fought in Korea. He commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972. He became Chief of Staff of the United States Army in 1972. When the Army began designing the next generation of American main battle tank in the early 1970s, the program was given a name, the M1 Abrams. The tank entered service in 1980. It and its successive variants would carry guns firing depleted uranium penetrators that defeated enemy armor through the same fundamental principle that had made the M93 HVAP work in a foggy field outside Arracourt in September of 1944. A small, dense projectile driven at the highest velocity the gun could achieve would defeat armor that a larger, slower projectile could not. That principle had cost lives to learn. It had been learned in the hedgerow country of Normandy, in the open fields of Lorraine, in the snow of the Ardennes, in the streets of Aachen and Cologne and 100 other places whose names appear on no monument and in no headline. It had been learned by men who carried handwritten lists of HVAP allocations in their breast pockets, by men who watched their last round bounce off a Panther's flank and sat in the silence afterward, wondering whether the German crew had seen them, by men who burned to death inside a tank that history would later argue had not been so much worse than the alternatives. The deciding number of the war in armored combat in Western Europe was not the muzzle velocity of the M93 round, or the penetration of tungsten carbide against rolled homogeneous armor at 1,000 yards. The deciding number was 49,324. That was the total number of M4 Sherman tanks of all variants that American factories produced during the war. The deciding number on the other side was 6,132. That was the total number of Panther tanks that German factories produced during the war. 8-to-1. That ratio was the war. The HVAP round was a small piece of a very large story. It was a piece that mattered. It was not the piece that mattered most. The piece that mattered most was the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the rubber plants of Akron, and the assembly lines of Detroit, and the ammunition factories of the Army Ordnance Department, and the convoys of Liberty ships running across an Atlantic that the United States Navy had cleared of submarines. It was the truck factories, and the tire factories, and the oil refineries, and the rail networks that moved all of it from the heartland to the ports, and from the ports to the front. And it was the men who carried those products into combat. Men who fought with imperfect weapons and imperfect ammunition and imperfect doctrine, and who brought the war to an end not because they had the best tank or the best gun or the best round, but because they had enough of all three and because they did not stop. Some of those men came home, some did not. The ones who came home put the war into a box inside themselves and closed it and did not open it for decades. The ones who did not come home are still there, in cemeteries across France and Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands, in rows of white crosses and stars of David that stand in quiet fields that were once battlefields and are now places where the grass grows green and the wind moves through the trees and the only sound is the sound of silence. You can visit them if you choose, on a quiet afternoon, in any month of any year. That is what is worth remembering.